Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. We interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests about innovation, leadership, and change in the world of business. Whether you're an executive or an entrepreneur, our objective is to help you and your organisation create an entrepreneurial culture, become more innovative, and better able to respond to change. Each week, we'll deconstruct world-class performance from the arenas of business, academia, science, and sports. Each week, you can expect key insights, fresh perspectives, and proven tools you can use straight away to make you more successful professionally and personally. With your host, Mark Bidwell.
Hello, welcome back to the Innovation Ecosystem. My name is Mark Bidwell, and if this is your first time listening, welcome to the show. I'm very excited this week to welcome onto the show Bob Johansen, who is a distinguished fellow at the Institute for the Future. And he's been helping organisations around the world prepare for and shape the future for nearly 40 years. And as a distinguished fellow of the Institute for the Future, he draws on his training in the social sciences and his extensive experience at the edges of multiple disciplines as he interacts with top leaders of businesses, government and non-profit organisations to encourage thoughtful consideration of the long-term future. And in the interview, Bob explains how he and the Institute for the Future help companies like McKinsey, Tesco, UPS, Disney, McDonald's, and my previous employer, Syngenta, navigate and survive in the VUCA world, which is short for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. You know, how they survive in the VUCA world 10 plus years from now. And he discusses the roles for leaders and organizations and individuals in this VUCA world of the future, what will and won't work, based on takeaways and case studies in his two recent books, Leaders Make the Future and The Reciprocity Advantage. And he provides a load of insights into what particular skills and mindsets we're going to need to employ in the next 10 years if we're looking to succeed. And some of Bob's insights on this latter point echo what we've been hearing from previous guests like Michael Gervais, Andy Walsh, etc. And how some words of wisdom from Peter Drucker informed his own mindset and habits, and what advice he has for those of us under 50. So there's a huge amount in here. As I say, super excited to have Bob on the show. I think you're going to enjoy this. So hello, this is Mark Bidwell from the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. Now with me today is Bob Johansen, who's a distinguished fellow at the Institute for the Future in Silicon Valley, where he helps top leaders around the world prepare for and shape the future. And Bob, you work with companies like McKinsey, Tesco, UPS, Kellogg, Disney, McDonald's, as well as Syngenta, which is where we first met.
Yes, that's right. I'm definitely not focused on any single industry. I'm more looking big picture, 10 or more years ahead across industries.
And you've been doing this for almost four decades?
I guess that's right. Yeah, a long time.
A long time. So we'll get into this. But I mean, the first thing I remember when we started working together was your use of the term the VUCA world, VUCA world. Now, for those who aren't familiar with it, I mean, perhaps you could just explain what that means, and also why do you think this has resonated so much around the world, this language?
Yeah. So VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it's a term that was coined at the graduate school for the U.S. Army in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I happened to be there for the first time the week before 9/11 and learned about that concept. And I am not a military guy by training, but since 9/11, I have spent quite a lot of time there at the graduate school for the Army and a number of other defense-related activities, just to try to figure out how military people are coping with this radical uncertainty. And to me, that concept of VUCA maybe began to make sense around 9/11, but in the current mood in the United States in particular, it makes even more sense to people. So I think that notion of just a radical uncertainty that envelopes everything else is a concept a lot of us can relate to. Now, I've actually tried to flip that, and I teach at the college now and with the military. And what I teach there is that volatility yields to vision in these times. So vision gets rewarded disproportionately. disproportionately. Uncertainty yields to understanding. This is a time to listen. Most people shout, and it's actually a time to listen. Complexity yields to clarity. And what wins in a VUCA world is to be very clear where you're going, but very flexible how you get there. And ambiguity yields to agility. Literally being a kind of corporate athlete is what works in this kind of world.
And this is language that you share with executives with a view to helping them navigate all these changes going on, right? So I guess presumably it gives glimpses of signposts as to how people can plan their investments, their acquisitions, their corporate development. Is that the sense in which this tends to be used in some of the large companies I mentioned in the intro?
Yeah, I think that's true on the good days. I think that the idea is to set expectations appropriately. And for most of today's leaders, we were taught to be problem solvers. And in a VUCA world, there still are problems that can be solved, but those will be solved by people who work for the top leaders. The top leaders will deal mostly with dilemmas, which are problems you can't solve, problems that won't go away, but you have to figure out how to win anyway. And in that kind of world, it's better to have your expectations set that it's a highly uncertain world with all these dilemmas, but then figure out how you can make things work anyway. And that's the challenge. So it's largely an expectations game. But it's also then figuring out what are the kinds of businesses, the kinds of organizational strategies that actually thrive in a VUCA environment as compared to a more stable, mature, predictable environment.
And can you give an example, perhaps from, a lot of our listeners are sitting in more sort of, old economy or more ex-growth or more mature industries. Can you give an example of a company that's embraced this and has changed what it's doing in the marketplace to reflect this?
Yeah, so let me give you a military example and then a business example. So in the military, in the U.S. Army, there's the conventional Army, and then there's the special forces. And now in the United States, they actually have two separate budgets. So the conventional Army is still hierarchical, it's more command and control, and it's more centralized. The special forces are more, I call them shape-shifting. They're shape-shifting organizations that are more fluid. There's no center. There's hierarchies come and go. They grow from the edges. They can't be controlled in conventional ways. So here's where that strategy, being very clear about direction, but very flexible about execution, makes sense. It's what the military calls commander's intent. And it's what I call the leadership skill of clarity. This is from my Leaders Make the Future book. If you take a company that's moved in this direction, I think IBM has. If you look at the old IBM, was more the centralized, hierarchical, and very conservative kind of structure, selling mainframe computers originally. And now it's much more focused on the Smarter Planet Initiative is kind of their general clarity statement, although they backed off on that a little lately. And now they're sort of pushing Watson and the big vision of Watson. But that's really all around big data know-how. And then the ways in which they make money off of that are much more shape-shifting, much more fluid, much more partnership-based. So I think there are examples in many big companies of these more special forces like or shape-shifting like structures that are coming about, not to replace the traditional, but to extend and expand. And I think in many ways, ultimately to replace. But at this stage, it's not about replacing, it's about extending.
Yeah, and you touched on your new book, which we'll come back to in a minute. But I think that's the concept of everything being distributed over or things becoming more and more distributed. I guess plays to that that model of command and control being pretty much redundant in this new environment. But maybe we can come back to that because you touched on something or beginning to get into something which is this wonderful book which you wrote recently called The Reciprocity Advantage, a new way to partner for innovation and growth. And a lot of the companies, the companies that I work with, but also the people listening to this show are in large companies that are struggling to innovate and to grow. Now, I mean, reciprocity, it's a great definition. It lies in the space between transactions and philanthropy. but it isn't about not making money. You can practice reciprocity and make money at the same time. Can you say a little bit about, and maybe we had the conversation before we went live on this. I mean, around reciprocity is a fundamental characteristic of human relations going back, I studied anthropology many years ago. There are hunter-gatherer cultures that are based around reciprocity. I mean, how did you land on this concept? Because it doesn't feel like a very edgy, word that perhaps lands in our capitalist environment. Can you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah. We often say in the futures world that juxtaposition, putting things that don't normally go together, that juxtaposition is a research methodology. And what's powerful about this concept is bringing reciprocity together with advantage. So reciprocity is a very ancient human need, I would say, and competitive advantage is a business requirement. So the challenge is, how can you bring those two together? And I did this book with Carl Rahn, who is, he was at the time anyway. Now he's kind of left and he's on his own as an innovation consultant. But Carl is the guy at Procter & Gamble behind Swiffer and Mr. Clean Magic Eraser and Febreze and other products that didn't have a category at the time P&G created them. So he's all about creating new categories. And what he's learned in that process is that many times you can't just develop it yourself and then sell it. You have to partner with others who allow you to do things you couldn't do alone. So I'm more of a foresight to insight guy. And what I believe is that as you look 10 years ahead in this increasingly VUCA, increasingly distributed world, you have to figure out new models of innovation. And one way to innovate is to look at your underutilized assets, essentially give those away in the faith that if you partner with somebody who has something you don't have, you'll get back even more in return. So going back to the IBM example, when they took Watson, the smartest computer out there at the moment, the artificial intelligence, although now they're calling it augmented intelligence, when they put Watson in the cloud, they gave away application consulting. So they said, we'll help you develop an app for Watson, and we'll put that in the cloud. But then they get a return from every time Watson is used through the cloud. So it's very much like the App Store. The Apple App Store was the first one to do this. And you don't think of Apple as reciprocity based because they're making so much money off of it. Yep. But that's okay. Yeah, it's okay. They're giving people a platform they wouldn't have had otherwise. And then they're charging a proportion of that.
And people sitting in publicly quoted companies are probably thinking, well, how does that work? Because in Syngenta, we there are lots of ways that we could create value in the marketplace, but the real challenge was, how do you actually capture that value? I mean, any sense of how those kind of conversations play out in the corporate world? I mean, because retrospectively one can tell the story, but in the real time, when you're having to influence stakeholders in the organization and maybe shareholders that this makes sense, it's probably quite difficult conversations to have, because it's based on a leap of faith, of course, isn't it?
Well, there is a leap of faith, but there's also a shared risk element of this. So in the Syngenta world, it's all about partnering with farmers, for example, or suppliers or governments to do things that couldn't be done alone. And it's going to be fascinating now that Syngenta is part of ChemChina to see how that plays out in a socialist market economy, where reciprocity is more built into that way of thinking. But in a traditional publicly traded company, I'm not saying this takes over the whole thing. I'm just saying in a portion of your innovation, you think about, first of all, what's your right of way? What are the underutilized assets that you have that you could give away to establish something new, a new business opportunity? And then who could you partner with to do something you couldn't do alone? And then how could you experiment with that? And then once you figure out how you can make money from it and how you can achieve some kind of sustainable advantage, you only scale it after you reach that stage. So again, going back to IBM, the example we used in the book was an experiment they did a few years back now in the city of Louisville, where they partnered with a startup company to track how kids with asthma use inhalers as they walk around the city. And each inhaler had a GPS sensing device, which allowed you to see where the spray had been used. IBM is amazing at big data analytics, and they were able to put that all together and make sense out of the patterns, and then either figure out a way to lower the pollution levels in those areas, or at least to route the kids around those areas so they didn't have to use them as much. So, that's an example of IBM realized their right of way was big data know-how. They partnered with this startup company, a really small company. And that's one of the remarkable things about IBM right now. You look at all the partners they're partnering with, radically smaller companies. And then you prototype in a very small scale way. And then you only scale when things come out of that make it clear how you can make money out of them for the long run. So this makes practical business sense. It's not just giving things away. It's actually lowering risk and creating a new formula for innovation.
And as you know, this podcast is called the Innovation Ecosystem, partly for the very simple reason that, very rarely do companies have all the resources that they need or all the relationships in the four walls of their company. So that's one of the sort of philosophical ideas behind this show. And I guess I'm curious, a lot of the examples you use in the book are tech based, and one can understand that the data opens up all sorts of opportunities. Are there any non-tech companies that are practicing this? Maybe we can just get into that, because I think I'm interested in how relevant is this for the rump of the economy as of today, if you like.
Yeah. Let me just reflect a little bit on the book. The book came out a little more than 2 years ago now. And as I'm reflecting on it, we probably published it 5 years too early, which for me as a futurist is about right. I really am not interested in writing mass market books. I'm interested in writing books about 5 to 10 years before somebody does a mass market book. So this one I think we got about right, but it's not quite there yet. And you're seeing it first in tech because of the so-called platform economy. And platforms make it so much easier to share innovation, like the App Store or Watson in the cloud. The platform mentality and the platform technology makes it so much easier to do. So I don't think there are examples that I've found yet of things that don't involve technology one way or another, because you need a basis for sharing, a basis for collaboration. Certainly there are non-tech industries that are involved in this, but often the tech kind of sneaks in through the back door. And one example of that from a non-tech area that surprised me after the book came out, Major League Baseball, which is increasingly international, but is really a U.S. sport. They made a decision some 15 years ago to, instead of having each team have their own website, to pool that in the middle. And they created something called Major League Baseball Advanced Media. And they've been prototyping that now for the last 15 years. And it's just reached the point now where it's become a big business to provide premium digital services. And what they realized was the premium digital services, which were developed for Major League Baseball, can be used for anything else. So they've now started selling those premium digital services to TV shows, like Game of Thrones now is distributed through Major League Baseball Advanced Media. Political campaigns, they have politicians that are their clients on both sides of the aisle. So you could easily imagine a situation there where Major League Baseball realizes that, hey, our right of way is this ability to connect people in premium digital ways, and we could sell those services. And ultimately, they may you could imagine a scenario where Major League Baseball becomes a advanced digital media company that just happens to play baseball.
Yep. It's fascinating, but I mean, I'd also, I mean, Bob, you say the book kind of, it's still evolving, but you give a lovely example towards the end about what does this mean for the individual, and maybe you can just take us through that, because I think a lot of folks listening to this, might be thinking, well, what does this mean for me? Not necessarily in the workplace, but me as I'm thinking about future-proofing my career, if you like. Maybe we can just go through the 4 steps there, because I think it's a lovely example of putting this into action, if you like.
Yeah, it was a really interesting, memorable moment for me when I was working on the book before it came out. I did a retreat for 15 top leaders in a major retailer. And these are all mid-level. They were already running big businesses, but they were on their way up fast for this global retailer. And there's 15 of them, and they're sitting on couches, and I'm working with them for a day about the future. And we're halfway through the afternoon. And one of the stars of this rising star group just stopped the conversation and said, I appreciate all the stuff you're telling us, Bob, about the future, but I'm just realizing I'm not ready for this. And then she started to cry. And it just kind of broke down the whole meeting. And her colleagues responded with great support and said, no, there are things you can do in this. So basically, she turned it back to me and said, well, what do we do? So what we worked out there and what we talked about at the end of the book is how the first question is, what's your right of way? What's your personal story that works in a VUCA world? What is it you can do? What is it you can do that gives advantage, that gives performance in this kind of VUCA world? And then secondly, who could you partner with to do what you could not do alone? So in this case, she was emphasizing as her right of way, her social skills and her ability to kind of calm people down in highly stressful times like they have in retail all the time. Who can I partner with? She decided that what she needed to do was partner with a much younger person. I'm particularly interested in those 21 or less in 2017, because they're the ones who are kind of in the digital native zone. They became adults since these new media actually became media. The millennials are interesting and they've added a lot, but they're actually too old and they're not real digital natives. So they add a lot, but I'm particularly interested in those 21 or less. So she said, well, I need to find somebody like that. And she ended up kind of identifying her cousin, and it was kind of a double count because it was for business and for personal, and then to try out different strategies, experiment, if you will. And then in terms of scaling, how to bring that back to her career choices and make career choices around it. But it's not going to be a predictable world. It's going to be a VUCA world. So you ask yourself, well, how do I thrive in that world anyway?
Well, but I mean, these are, this idea of, your right of way. I mean, I call it your unfair advantage, but I mean, that will evolve over time. But to nail that at a point in time is hugely valuable. And then, of course, the immersive learning that comes with this learning by experimenting is, that is, it's a given now, I guess, that learning shouldn't really stop when you graduate. I mean, but there's more and more. I mean, I was speaking to someone today. I mean, he was saying that for 20 years in the corporate world, he didn't do much learning because he didn't need to. But now coming out of the corporate world, he's on fire for it because he realizes how valuable it can be and what the range of options it opens up for him. So it's good stuff. This and I guess it also plays out in if you're running a business. I mean, to go through this process, as you said, I mean, which was the service in which a book was written. I guess is to be able to do this audit of what is your what are your assets, your right of way from a corporate point of view is valuable as well.
Yes, and particularly your underutilized assets. It's your assets that are obvious are the things you're already getting rewarded for. But what are the things you're really good at that you're not actually utilizing in some way? And that, to me, that's the more provocative question.
Yep. And then now you're moving to your new book, which isn't out yet, but it will be coming out later on in 2017. And this is essentially, I mean, the new leadership literacy is a subtitle, whether it's working or not, but it's thriving in a future of extreme disruption and distributed everything. The latter part of that title around distributed everything, can you just say a little bit about that? Because we're going to go back into where we started the conversation about the military against.
Yeah. So again, I'm a 10-year forecaster. So I'm always looking 10 years ahead, and I've been living my life 10 years ahead for the last 30 plus years. And one of the things that I realized as I finished the book called Leaders Make the Future, which was identified 10 leadership skills that are necessary to thrive in the future. One of the things that I realized was that skills aren't enough, that it's going to be necessary to wrap those skills in larger literacies that put together a wider understanding of what's actually going on. And it turns out what I've realized in this 30 plus years of doing this is that you have to not only look to the future, you have to look to the past. And our rule of thumb is you look 10 years out, you look at least 50 years back. And that allows you to see the cycle of change. And what I've realized is that the cycle of change, which began with the internet, and roughly the internet started in 1968, and it was publicly introduced in 1972. The World Wide Web didn't take off till the early 1990s. And what I'm realizing is that what's happened so far, we think the internet is a mature technology, and I think it's the beginning. And Kevin Kelly says it's the beginning of the beginning.
Yeah, he was on our show earlier on last year, and it was an extraordinary individual, of course.
Yeah, no, cool. And so Kevin's writing about the technology shift. I'm writing more about what does that mean for leaders. And the big underlying shift that I have realized, and certainly is implicit in Kevin's book too, is that we're beginning from this period with the internet. That was the invention of packet switching, moving from centralized networks to distributed packets. So with centralized networks in the Cold War period, if you took down any portion of the network, you were at risk of taking down the whole network. But with packet switching, you created this little burst that got broken down immediately into a packet and not reassembled till it got to the other end. And that's the remarkable thing about it. Now, it's taken this long now to scale. And the general shift is from centralized to decentralized to truly distributed. And packet switching is the underlying technology that makes that possible. Now, it's taken all these years to now be ready to scale, but over the next decade, it's going to scale. So my rule of thumb, and this is the essence, maybe this is the most important thing I'm going to say. If you can buy into this one, here's what's going to happen. Anything that can be distributed will be distributed. So we'll still have centralized things where there is stability, there's market maturity, there's predictability, but there won't be very many of those places anymore. And in general, anything that can be distributed will be distributed. And that's going to mean we're going to have many more of these shape-shifting organizations. So we're going to have many more special forces kind of units and far less hierarchical, stable units. Now, that has big implications for leaders because it's a real different idea to lead a shape-shifting organization than it is to tell people what to do.
Yeah, but it's not just delegation, I guess, is it? I mean, it's more sophisticated. It's far more sophisticated model than that.
It's not just delegation. Delegation is fine where it works. But you can't, delegation only works in predictable structures.
Yep.
Where if you go back to what I mentioned earlier about commander's intent in a military context, you want to be very clear about direction, but you want to be very flexible about execution. That's not just delegation. That's creating an envelope of clarity within which the people doing the actual work have great freedom as long as they stay in the envelope of clarity, but they're not just doing what they were told.
Mm-hmm. So it's having a North Star that you're aiming towards, but if you zigzag your way there, that's okay, so long as the people understand that. In Syngenta we call it the liberating disciplines, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the North Star model is basically what we're talking about, but you can't predict how the path will develop in the field. And one of the big issues, if you look at any of the kind of modern military mass market films, things like Zero Dark 30, for example, you can see the tension between increasingly distributed organizations, but there's still hierarchy there. Mm-hmm. You had this crazy image of the president in the Situation Room watching the attack on Osama bin Laden. So it's sort of the old-fashioned hierarchy and the distributed. Now, they weren't telling people what to do, but they actually had a very good view of it. And the whole art of leadership then becomes, what is the role of the ultimate leader, going right up to the commanders in chief, but apply that in a business world. What's the role of the CEO? And that's to provide clarity, values, and this vision of where things are going. But the role of the leaders within that envelope of clarity, that's where there's great flexibility as to how they actually do it. So it's way beyond delegation.
Yeah. And I mean, this is, I guess from someone starting their career or maybe sort of mid-career, this is, there's plenty of time for them to potentially learn these new skills. But on the other hand, if you're sitting on the board of a company at the moment, you've got another 5 or 10 years, this is quite scary, I suspect.
I think it is. And so the major advice I have for those of us who are not digital natives, and even though I grew up with the internet, I'm not either. The major advice I have is to develop reverse mentoring relationships with much younger people. Yep. And that's a simple thing you can do. The way I do it in my work is I rotate every roughly 2 years. I bring in a new person who's much younger than I am. Usually what I'm looking at is at least less than 25, who are different from me in an interesting way. And it's got to be a way that I want to learn about. So, for example, I had when I was doing Reciprocity and Advantage, I had a young economist working with me because I wanted to learn about economics. The next person I had was from Africa and had spent a lot of his time in Africa the last few years. The person I have with me now is a video gamer for life, and he's a person who's 26 years old and has lived in 10 different countries in his life. And he's a deep water video gamer. So I think that's something you can do in a very practical way to help figure out what is it you can add. And we can, the neat thing about aging is, we tend to devalue it in the digital world, but there really is a really big advantage that we have. If you're over 50, you have license to play the wisdom game. Mm-hmm. The wisdom game. Yep. But you got to know how to apply that wisdom in an increasingly digital world. And you don't just back off and say, oh, that's for the kids. You learn enough about it that you can apply your wisdom in that context. And that's what reverse mentoring helps you do.
And the book, I mean, that's this is the first time after probably 50 podcasts that anyone's referred to reverse mentoring, and it's fascinating that it's cropped up here. The book is, I guess, also going to have a number of other, you say in the document sent across, full of practical advice for how leaders can make the future a better place. So, I mean, presumably that's an example of some of the stuff that people can do straight away, to prepare themselves for this new world or the world that's shaping around them.
Yeah, One of the future leadership literacies that I write about in the new book is what I call voluntary fear engagement.
Yeah, it's a lovely term, that, isn't it?
and as an anthropologist, I'm sure you can relate to this. And
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily involve digital media or video gaming, although video gaming is the best human interface we've ever had, particularly as we now moving into virtual reality and mixed reality and blended reality. So I think what's happening is what we think of today as video gaming is evolving into the most powerful learning medium in history. And we see it through things like Twitch, for example, which is now professional video gaming. But increasingly, it's a medium for learning. And of course, Amazon just bought them. So it's really interesting platform shift there. But I think as young people move into the workforce, the true digital natives are 21 or less now, so they're just starting to enter. But they'll have a big competitive advantage over us. But on the other hand, when we have these reverse mentoring relationships, we can immerse ourselves in these fearful environments and try out leadership styles. And that's basically what the military does with wargaming. They expose people to dangerous situations and then allow them to practice in low risk ways. It's harder to do in business, but it's the same principle.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that because, I mean, we had a previous guest on who works for Red Bull Performance, and he worked with people like Felix Baumgartner and stuff. And he talked about how he actually trains his sports people to actually practice failing and practice feeling physically.
Nice.
What is it? And I was struck by why don't we do that in the corporate world from an innovation point of view? Because we know that most of our activities are going to fail. Have you seen anyone doing any of that kind of stuff, or is it still a little bit it's difficult to grasp what that would look like?
I see a lot of pockets of it. Another person that would be great to have on your show is Andy Billings from Electronic Arts. He is their equivalent of a chief learning officer, although they don't call him that. But he created EA University, and they use voluntary fear engagement and simulated work environments to do executive and leadership development programs. And I teach in one of them there. But that's the most impressive program that I've seen this side of the military. Yeah. The military is way ahead of business in this.
Yep. I mean, fantastic. I'd love to maybe see if we can have an intro to Andy, because that sounds exactly like the kind of stuff that is lacking so much, because a whole conversation around failure in the context of innovation really doesn't go very far in a lot of organizations. So that could be a useful point of leverage. So, I mean, I'm mindful of your time, Bob. This has been fascinating. 3 questions I sent to you in advance, and one of them in particular, I guess, is going to be. I'm really interested in your answer to this because as you say, you look out. You're looking 10 years. You're living 10 years out, if you like. So, what have you changed your mind about recently?
Well, here's one example. Walmart is a company that I didn't think of as a source of innovation, and particularly didn't think of it as a source of values-based innovation. But I got the chance to do a custom forecast with them over the last year, and it's quite turned me around, and I've definitely changed my mind. If you ever get a chance to visit the Walmart Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas, it kind of tells the story of Walmart, but it's definitely a values-based company. It's family run, even though it's publicly traded. The family owns the majority of the shares, and there's a very rigid structure with quite a lot of foresight built into it that allows the company to take a longer term orientation. And my experience with them is they have been much more innovative than what I expected. Now, obviously, they're under a lot of external pressures too. But that's an example, I think, of where a company has gotten a very bad reputation. And for a lot of people, they're locked in to thinking, oh, Walmart is an evil company, without re-looking at it. And I think particularly in this kind of VUCA world, we're going to see more and more of those where our stereotypes turn out to be incorrect. And this was a case where I did change my mind.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. And then the second question, what do you do to remain creative and innovative?
It's a lot easier here at the Institute because we're about 50 people full time here in downtown Palo Alto. And it skews young, it skews female, it skews international. And we no longer have closed offices. So when I don't even have a desk here anymore. So it's really been interesting. And most of us don't, including the senior people here. And we used to have closed offices up on Santo Road, beautiful offices. So I had this beautiful large office looking out to the hills. And now I have no office at all. And I'm much happier with no office at all.
Really?
And when I'm here, I work in the coffee shop area and people walk by. And it's a constant turmoil of ideas and energies. So I think what you have to do is find a space that energizes you, that keeps you excited. And even though I'm traveling most of the time and I'm on the road, I'm very externally facing. I come back here to get renewed, and we all have to find what's the place where we go to get renewed. And for me, it's Institute for the Future.
Yeah. Well, it's lovely to have that sort of wellspring of energy and creativity right at your workplace. I mean, that must be wonderful.
Yes, no, it's very exciting, and I've been here a long time, and it's better than it's ever been. So that is really interesting to me, that it's continued to grow in terms of its energy and its creativity, even though it's intentionally small in terms of numbers. So our kind of motto is how to have a big impact on big ideas without being big, and I think there's some truth in that statement too.
Yeah. Well, I can't remember, what is the number? There's a certain number beyond which the organization gets sort of unmanageable and loses its sort of character. Was it the Dunbar number or something? I can't remember what it is, but it's a little bit more than 50, isn't it?
It's roughly, but I think that's provocative, but I think it varies depending on the environment and the content.
Yeah, absolutely. Final question. I mean, to what do you attribute your success in life? I mean, have you got any specific skills or habits or mindsets that you've mastered that have really made a significant impact?
I got to visit Peter Drucker in the last year of his life, and I spent an afternoon in his living room with A.G. Lafley when he was the CEO of Procter & Gamble. And we talked about human resources. And one of the things that I took away from that conversation is what he said was, the first half of your life, work on many things and with many different kinds of people because you don't know who you are. And then the second half in your life, only work on things you're passionate about and only work with people with whom you love to work. So, lovely. And this is so optimistic because, Peter Drucker was 94 at the time, and he was still well worth spending an afternoon with. So that means the halfway point in your life is maybe, 45 or 50. So it's quite optimistic. But what I found is that early in my life, I was lots of different things, some of which worked and some of which didn't. But I think I've gotten more clear now about what my priorities are. And now I see myself primarily as a writer, focused on the future, and books are my medium. So I've tried blogging, tweeting, a whole range of other things. I really like books, so I write books, and I do talks. I do public talks. I do workshops. I really like interactive workshops, and I'm focused on the future. So, and I've now picked out kind of the sorts of people that I like to be around, and fortunately have found a place that is a constantly churning source of those kind of people, because I have to keep expanding my knowledge base too. So for me, that's what's worked. I think I guess the general advice I'd give is sort of if you're less than 50, don't worry if you don't have focus, and do as many things as you possibly can. If you're more than 50, get focused. And do not work with people that are toxic for you. Do not work with people you don't thrive with. And that's why I think many people, the word retirement, I think, is obsolete. But if for many people, they have to redirect because their career is not fulfilling enough. I'm lucky I don't have to do that. But you have to find whatever the term, I went to divinity school, the term in divinity school is what's your calling. And you can take a while to figure that out. But once you find it, then do it.
It's lovely. I mean, I'm struck by, I remember the expression someone said to me, do you want to be a wandering generality or do you want to be a meaningful specific? And what you and what you've said, Bob, is you've given me permission to do both, right? So I'm on the sort of second nine of my life, just made the turn essentially, but I'm personally moving from this wandering generality to meaningful specific. And the other point that there's a friend of mine who works with me on this program, on this business, and he talks about his two filters are people you rate and people you trust, and you should, which I think is lovely. I mean, he's actually even bought the domain rateandtrust.com, but I mean, but that gets to what Drucker said as well, right? I mean, life's too short to hang around with people So some great wisdom there from arguably the greatest management thinker on the planet, right? I think you could say that, and it's interesting to me. One of the signs of aging for me is that now when I speak to audiences, I can't assume that they know who Peter Drucker is. Yeah. Well, that's particularly, and he was, what was he, 94, 95?
When he passed away, I believe he was 94.
Yeah, extraordinary. So this has been fantastic, Bob. Where can people get in touch with you?
Well, through the Institute. So the Institute's website has all of our content and my books and the links. So it's Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. So it's IFTF.org.
Wonderful.
But maybe you can just put the links to
we'll put it all
Institute,
in the show notes.
My books in the back. Yeah.
Perfect. We'll do that. And you alluded to Twitter and other, but I guess the Institute is the best place to track you down.
The Institute is on all social media, but my strategy is I'm focused 10 years ahead. So I am on all current media right when they start. And usually I phase out of them as they become more popular and I'm off to the next blob on the horizon.
So what is that? Is there an emerging technology that you're, communication technology you're on at the moment, which we won't have heard of yet or not?
Not that I can talk about.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, but I think that the next wave of social media is going to be a mix of these radically distributed with periodically centralized links. So it's really all about curation and filtering. Yeah. So I am thinking a lot about virtual assistants and about curation, which is one of the hottest words in Silicon Valley right now, and the whole notion of maybe what you call augmented curation. That's the kind of functionality that I'm really interested in, that starts to sort out what are the things computers can do best, and Watson's taken us so far down that road, and then what are the things humans can do best.
Yeah, well, I mean that language filtering and curation, Kevin Kelly writes quite a lot about in his latest book as well.
He does.
Yeah,
he does. Yeah.
Fascinating, Bob. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sure our listeners will have enjoyed it as much as I have. And next time you're in Switzerland, look us up.
Thank you. I hope so, and I hope I can come back on to talk about the new book when it comes out in September.
Absolutely, we'll schedule that. But many thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Cheers.
So it's Mark again, and it's extremely easy in the current environment to get massively overwhelmed by what is an increasingly VUCA world. And so I found this really interesting because, Bob does provide some insights into, what kind of behaviors are going to win in this VUCA world. And it's all about being clear on direction and setting expectations and being able to cope with and position ourselves within this uncertainty and ambiguity. And in Bob's, world of 10 years out, he envisaged that it's going to become more and more important for companies to recognize that they don't have all the necessary resources and mindsets within their four walls. So expanding and extending and connecting with others can be an integral part of overcoming this. And this is essentially, the ecosystem thinking that we are developing through this program and the related services that we're beginning to bring into the market. And perhaps unsurprisingly, technology is going to play a pivotal role in enabling us to reach our potential and to utilize our untapped assets and to connect and to share and collaborate with others. And Bob talks a lot about the digital natives and their fluency with technology as well as their fluency with seeking new and unique experiences. And the human of the future, as a result, is going to be a very different one. And again, echoes here from Kevin Kelly, a previous guest, another very, very accomplished futurist who's got a tremendous track record at predicting what's coming down the road towards us. So again, really looking forward to getting Bob perhaps back on the show when his new book is published later on in the year. But in the meantime, hope you found it valuable. Please let us know what you think on any of our numerous platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. You can drop me an email, mark@innovationecosystem.com, or visit the website, www.innovationecosystem.com, and let us know what you think of our work. Many thanks. Have a great week.